Wyoming Territory, 1873. Caleb Blackwood measured his days by the slow crawl of the sun across the vast, indifferent sky. It rose over the jagged teeth of the eastern peaks, bled across the plains, and sank behind the western ridges, leaving behind a bruise of purple and orange that faded to a cold, star-dusted black. His world was one of fences that needed mending, cattle that needed tending, and a silence so profound it had its own weight. The silence was his companion, his shield, and his penance. It filled the empty spaces in his cabin, the empty chair at his table, the empty side of his bed. He had carved this life of solitude out of the raw wilderness with the same deliberate force he used to split logs for the winter stove, believing that a man who needed nothing could lose nothing. From the porch of his sturdy log cabin, he could see the whole of his domain. The rolling grasslands, bleached to the color of old bone by the late summer sun, stretched to the horizon. A ribbon of creek, fringed with cottonwoods whose leaves were just beginning to turn, snaked through his property, a lifeline in the arid expanse. In the distance, the single iron track of the Transcontinental Railroad cut a stark, straight line through the landscape, a man-made scar on the face of the earth. It was a constant reminder of the world he had left behind, a world of noise and crowds and connections that had proven as fragile as spun glass. He had learned the hard way that attachments could shatter like glass against stone, leaving behind only sharp edges that cut deep. A hawk circled high overhead, a dark speck against the brilliant, cloudless blue. Caleb watched its lazy spiral, his gaze sharp and his face a mask of hardened composure. His features looked as if they had been chiseled from the same granite as the nearby mountains. A strong jaw dusted with dark stubble, a straight nose, and eyes the color of a stormy sky. They were eyes that had seen too much of war and loss, and now they saw only the practical necessities of survival. He had fought for the Union, had returned to a home hollowed out by influenza, and had buried a wife and infant son in a cold Ohio churchyard. Then he had come west, seeking not a new life, but an absence of one, a place where the ghosts of his past would be too tired to follow. He finished his coffee, the bitter liquid of familiar morning ritual. The scent of pine from the surrounding forest mingled with the smell of leather from his worn saddle and the faint, clean aroma of the lye soap Martha, his housekeeper, used on the porch floorboards. Martha came twice a week from the small town of Redemption Creek, a stout, no-nonsense woman with kind eyes who seemed to understand his need for silence. She cooked, cleaned, and filled his pantry, her presence a quiet intrusion he tolerated because it was easier than starving. She never pried, never offered platitudes, but sometimes he would catch her looking at him with a pity he neither wanted nor acknowledged. He was about to step off the porch and head for the stables when a sound cut through the morning stillness. It was a distant sound, but one that carried for miles in the clean, thin air, the mournful wail of a train whistle. It was the Tuesday train, the one that brought mail, supplies, and the occasional foolhardy soul from the east, chasing dreams of gold or land or reinvention. Caleb rarely went to the station. He had his supplies delivered by the boy who worked at the general store. The arrival of the train was an event that belonged to the town, not to him. It represented an influx of the very thing he had come here to escape. People with their complicated needs and their devastating capacity for leaving. Yet today, for a reason he could not name, the sound held him in place. It was a disruption, a tear in the fabric of his meticulously ordered day. He found his gaze fixed on that distant iron track, where a plume of black smoke smudged the pristine horizon. The whistle blew again, closer this time, a long, lonely cry that echoed off the hills and seemed to settle in the hollow space inside his chest. He felt a strange and unwelcome flicker of something. Not curiosity, not exactly. It was more like the primal alertness of an animal sensing a change in the wind, a premonition that the quiet fortress he had built around himself was about to be breached. He shook his head, a short, sharp gesture of dismissal. It was just a train. It meant nothing to him. He turned his back on the sound and walked toward the barn. The rhythmic creak of his leather boots on the hard-packed earth a reassuring return to the familiar. But the echo of the whistle followed him, a harbinger of the world rushing toward him, whether he was ready for it or not. Eliza Covington stepped down from the stuffy, soot-caked passenger car and onto the splintered planks of the Redemption Creek station platform. She took a deep breath, and the air, so different from the cold-choked atmosphere of Philadelphia, filled her lungs. It was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and something wild and clean, like pine needles crushed underfoot. The sun was a brilliant, almost violent presence in a sky of impossible blue, and the light made her blink. Everything was painted in stark, vivid colors. The dusty tan of the main street, the deep green of the distant mountains, the weathered gray of the wooden buildings that lined the road. It was a world stripped of softness, a world of sharp edges and raw beauty. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress, a deep blue serge that had seemed practical in the city, but now felt heavy and out of place. Her hands, clad in slightly dusty white gloves, clutched a reticule. Inside was a letter from her cousin, Mr. Alastair Finch, the letter that had brought her all this way. After her parents' sudden passing, Alastair's offer of a governess position for his children in this burgeoning western town had seemed like a godsend, a lifeline thrown to her across a continent. He had promised to meet her at the station, to welcome her to her new life. Her gaze swept the platform. A few rough-looking men in dusty hats and worn denim trousers were unloading freight. A woman with a tired face was trying to corral two small, energetic children. The station master, a harried man with a green visor, was shouting instructions. But there was no sign of a well-dressed gentleman who might be Alastair. There was no one who looked like family. A knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach, a cold counterpoint to the heat of the sun on her shoulders. She stood beside her trunk, a solitary figure in a sea of purposeful motion, feeling the weight of 1,000 miles and a dwindling hope. Her honey-blonde hair, pinned meticulously that morning, was beginning to escape its confines, soft tendrils framing a face that was pale with fatigue and growing anxiety. The train gave a final, great hiss of steam and began to pull away, its whistle a departing cry. As the last car receded down the track, a sense of finality settled over her. The bridge to her old life was gone. She was here, in this raw, unfamiliar place, and she was utterly alone. The crowd on the platform thinned, people drifting away into the dusty street, until it was just her, her trunk, and the station master, who was now eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and impatience. Caleb had finished his work at the barn and decided, on an impulse he immediately regretted, to ride into town. He told himself it was for a sack of grain he needed, an excuse so thin it was transparent even to him. The truth was that the train's whistle had unsettled him, planting a seed of restlessness in his soul. As he rode his steady bay gelding, Apollo, down the main street, he saw her. She stood on the station platform like a painting that had been hung in the wrong gallery, a slash of deep blue against the muted earth tones of the town. She was all refined lines and delicate posture, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn world around her. He saw the elegant sweep of her neck, the lost look in her eyes as she scanned the empty platform. She was clearly from the east, and, just as clearly, she was in some kind of trouble. His first instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, was to ride on. It was not his concern. Getting involved was a fool's errand, an invitation for complication to enter his well-ordered life. He had his own ghost to wrestle. He had no room for anyone else's. He urged Apollo forward, his jaw set. But as he drew level with the station, he saw her shoulders slump in a gesture of profound disappointment. She swayed slightly, a hand going to her forehead as if to ward off a wave of dizziness from the heat and exhaustion. Something inside him, a deeply buried instinct for protection he thought had died with his family, stirred. It was against his better judgment, against every rule he had set for himself. But he could not simply ride past. He could not leave this fragile-looking creature to wilt under the harsh Wyoming sun. With a low curse directed at his own weakness, he reined Apollo in and swung down from the saddle. The jingle of his spurs was loud in the sudden quiet of the platform. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. She looked up as he approached, her eyes, a startling shade of cornflower blue, widening with a mixture of hope and fear. He stopped a few feet away, pulling off his hat as a reluctant concession to courtesy. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You seem to be expecting someone." Eliza felt a wave of relief, so potent it almost buckled her knees. "Yes," she breathed, her voice trembling slightly. "My cousin, Mr. Alastair Finch. He was to meet me." Caleb's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. He knew of no Alastair Finch in Redemption Creek, and he knew nearly everyone, at least by name. This was worse than he thought. "There is no man by that name in this town," he stated, the words flat and final, leaving no room for doubt. The color drained from Eliza's face. The last vestiges of her hope crumbled, turning to a fine, cold dust of fear. "No, but his letter." She fumbled in her reticule, her fingers shaking as she withdrew the folded paper. The ink was clear, the address specific. Redemption Creek, Wyoming Territory. It had to be a mistake. A simple misunderstanding. It had to be. She took a step forward, intending to show him the letter, to prove her cousin's existence. But the ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The long journey, the lack of food, the crushing weight of her disappointment. It all converged in a dizzying rush. The world dissolved into a blur of brown and blue. Her knees gave way, and she pitched forward, a faint cry escaping her lips. Caleb moved faster than he had in years. He dropped his hat and lunged, his arms closing around her just before she hit the hard planks of the platform. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his arms. Her head fell back against his shoulder, and the scent of lavender and starch rose from her hair, a ghost of a civilized world he had long since forgotten. He held her there, this unexpected, fainting woman, a stranger who had somehow breached his defenses without even trying. The physical contact was a shock to his system, an unwelcome intimacy that sent a jolt through him. For the first time in a long time, the silence of his world was broken, not by a train whistle, but by the soft, unsteady rhythm of another person's breathing against his chest. He found himself in a position he had actively avoided for 5 years, responsible for another human being. He looked down at the woman in his arms. Her face, now that the anxiety was smoothed away by unconsciousness, was finely made, with high cheekbones and a delicate mouth. A stray curl of honey blonde hair had fallen across her forehead. He felt a surge of irritation, mostly at himself for his own foolishness. He should have kept riding. The station master, Mr. Abernathy, scurried over, his face a mask of alarm. Is she all right, Mr. Blackwood?" "She's fainted," Caleb said, his tone clipped. "Heat and exhaustion, I'd wager." And a bad piece of news, he shifted her weight, lifting her more securely into his arms. She was a delicate burden, but a burden nonetheless. The cousin she was meeting, Alastair Finch. "You know him?" Abernathy shook his head, his jowls wobbling. "Never heard the name. Lived here 10 years. We get drifters and dreamers, but a name like that. I'd remember." His gaze softened as he looked at Eliza. "Poor thing. What's to become of her?" It was the question Caleb was trying to ignore. He could take her to the hotel, leave her in the care of the owner's wife. That would be the sensible thing to do. It would absolve him of further responsibility. But the image of her face, so pale and vulnerable, pricked at a conscience he thought was long dead. Leaving her at the town's only hotel, a place frequented by rough cowboys and prospectors, felt like abandoning a lamb among wolves. With a sigh of resignation that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, he made a decision. "I'll take her to my ranch. Martha is there today. She'll know what to do." Abernathy nodded, relief flooding his features. "A good choice, Mr. Blackwood. A very good choice. What about her trunk?" "Have the Miller boy bring it out later," Caleb instructed, already turning. He walked toward his horse, carrying Eliza as if she weighed nothing. Apollo snorted, eyeing the strange bundle in his master's arms, but stood steady. Caleb mounted with a practiced, fluid motion, settling Eliza in front of him, her head resting against his chest. It was an unnervingly familiar feeling, the weight of a woman held close, and it sent a fresh wave of unwelcome memories through him. He grit his teeth, pushed them away, and nudged Apollo into a gentle walk, away from the town and toward the grudging sanctuary of his home. Eliza awoke to the smell of lavender and wood smoke. She was lying in a bed, a real bed with clean, crisp sheets and a heavy quilt pulled up to her chin. Sunlight streamed through a nearby window, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air. The room was simple, spare, but impeccably clean. The walls were rough-hewn logs, the floor wide planks of polished wood. A simple wooden dresser stood against one wall, and a rocking chair sat near the window. It was a room of quiet, masculine simplicity. Memory returned in a disorienting flood. The train, the dusty platform, the devastating news, and the face of the stranger with the stormy gray eyes just before the world went dark. She sat up too quickly, a wave of dizziness washing over her. A woman bustled into the room, her face etched with kind wrinkles. She was carrying a tray with a steaming mug and a bowl of broth. "Easy now, dearie," the woman said, her voice warm and comforting. "You took quite a tumble." "I'm Marta. You're at the Blackwood Ranch." "Blackwood?" Eliza repeated, her voice hoarse. "The man at the station?" "That would be Caleb," Martha confirmed, setting the tray on the bedside table. "He brought you here. Said you needed a safe place to recover." She clucked her tongue. "Poor thing. All the way from the east on a wild goose chase. Men can be cruel creatures." Eliza felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "He was very kind. I must thank him." "You can try," Martha said with a wry smile. "Getting a thank you to stick to that man is like trying to nail jelly to a tree. But he has a good heart under all that granite. Now you eat this broth. You need your strength." Over the next 2 days, under Martha's gentle care, Eliza's physical strength returned, but her spirit remained bruised. The reality of her situation was a heavy weight. She was stranded, penniless, and utterly alone in a world that was alien to her. The life she had envisioned, a respectable position, a home, a purpose, had evaporated on that train platform. Caleb remained a distant, almost spectral presence. She would hear the sound of his boots on the porch in the early morning and see him riding out toward the fields, a solitary figure against the vast landscape. He ate his meals in the main room after she had retired to her own, a deliberate avoidance she both understood and was slightly stung by. He was a man who had wrapped himself in solitude, and she was an unwelcome tear in that fabric. On the third evening, she felt strong enough to join him for dinner. Martha had prepared a hearty beef stew and left it simmering on the stove before heading back to town. The air was filled with the savory aroma of cooked meat and vegetables. When Caleb entered the main room, washing his hands at the basin by the door, he stopped short upon seeing her at the table. For a moment, an awkward silence hung between them. The crackle of the fire in the great stone hearth was the only sound. Eliza's hands were clasped in her lap, her back straight, a posture ingrained by years of polite society. Caleb looked out of place in his own home, his powerful frame seeming too large for the domestic space. "You are feeling better," he stated. It was not a question. "Yes, thank you," Eliza replied, her voice soft but clear. "I am deeply indebted to you, Mr. Blackwood, and to Martha. You have shown me a kindness I did not expect and certainly did not deserve." He merely grunted in response, moving to the stove and ladling stew into 2 bowls. He set one in front of her and took his own seat at the opposite end of the long wooden table. The distance between them felt like a chasm. They ate in silence for several minutes, the clinking of spoons against pottery the only conversation. Eliza could not bear it. She needed to understand the man who had saved her, this man who seemed so determined to remain a stranger. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "This land, it is so vast, so empty. Does the quiet never bother you?" He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers across the table. His gaze was intense, analytical, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. "I prefer it," he said simply. Quiet doesn't betray you. The finality in his tone should have warned her off, but she felt a strange compulsion to press on. But surely, a person needs connection to share their life. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Attachments are a liability. They make a man weak. He pushed his bowl away, his appetite apparently gone. He rose and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames, his back to her. The firelight cast his shadow long and dark against the log wall, making him seem like a figure carved from darkness and sorrow. Eliza felt a pang of empathy for this wounded man. She saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the tension in his hands as he rested them on the stone mantel. He was not just a loner. He was a man in deep and abiding pain. She stood and walked to the other side of the hearth, keeping a respectful distance, but refusing to be dismissed. "I used to believe that," she said quietly. "After my parents died, I felt as if the world had ended. I was alone, and I thought I would be alone forever. This position with the man I thought was my cousin, it was my only hope. I thought it would be a new start." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "I suppose I was naive to believe it could be so simple." He did not turn, but she could feel him listening. The air between them was charged, heavy with unspoken grief. He had offered her a safe harbor, and she, in turn, was offering him a glimpse into her own brokenness, a shared vulnerability. Slowly, he spoke, his voice low and raspy, the words pulled from a place of profound hurt. "I had a wife, Sarah, and a son, Daniel." He said the names as if they were fragile relics he had not touched in years. "They died 5 years ago. Influenza took them both in less than a week." He finally turned to face her. In the flickering firelight, she saw that the storm in his eyes was not anger, but a bottomless ocean of grief. "I learned then that everything you love can be taken from you. The only way to stop the pain is to stop loving anything. The quiet is not empty. It's safe." In that moment, the chasm between them vanished. She saw past the gruff exterior, the intimidating silence, and the hardened facade. She saw a man who had loved so fiercely that the loss of that love had shattered his world. He had not chosen solitude out of misanthropy. He had chosen it as a shield to protect the raw, gaping wound in his soul. She did not offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. She knew they would be meaningless. Instead, she simply met his gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of understanding. It was a silent acknowledgement of their shared status as survivors, as people who had been left behind. He saw her not as a delicate Eastern lady, but as someone who understood the language of loss. And she saw him not as a cold recluse, but as a man with a heart so broken he had built a fortress around it to keep it from falling to pieces. A fragile bridge of mutual respect and shared sorrow had just been built in the quiet firelight of his solitary home. Over the following week, a tentative routine settled over the Blackwood Ranch. Eliza, refusing to be an idle guest, insisted on helping Martha with the household chores. She learned to knead bread, her soft hands growing accustomed to the feel of the dough. She mended Caleb's work shirts, her neat, precise stitches a stark contrast to his own clumsy repairs. She found a quiet purpose in these simple, domestic tasks, a way to anchor herself in this new, uncertain reality. She was not the helpless creature Caleb had first perceived. She was resilient, adaptable, and possessed a quiet strength that began to earn his grudging respect. Caleb, for his part, found his carefully constructed solitude irrevocably breached. Her presence was a constant, subtle disruption. It was the scent of lavender that now clung faintly to the linens, the sound of her soft humming as she worked in the kitchen, the sight of her sitting on the porch in the evenings, a book open in her lap, her hair catching the golden light of the setting sun. He tried to maintain his distance, keeping his interactions with her brief and practical, but he found himself watching her more often than he cared to admit. He saw the determination in her eyes as she learned to milk the cow, the genuine smile that lit her face when one of Martha's stories made her laugh. She was not a liability. She was life, a vibrant, intelligent life that had been thrust into his gray existence. His internal monologue was a battlefield. One part of him, the part that remembered the agony of loss, warned him to push her away, to send her to Cheyenne on the next train where she could find proper employment and be someone else's problem. But another, quieter part of him, a part he had thought long dead, was drawn to her courage and her grace. He started to see the world through her eyes, the beauty she found in a simple wildflower, the fascination with which she watched the hawks circle in the sky. She was reawakening senses in him he had deliberately dulled. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody rode out to the ranch. He was a man in his late 50s, with a weathered face and wise, kind eyes. He was one of the few people Caleb considered friend, though their friendship was one of few words and long, comfortable silences. "Caleb," Brody said, dismounting and accepting a dipper of water. "Heard you had a guest." His eyes twinkled as Eliza came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. "Sheriff," Caleb grunted, introducing them. "This is Miss Covington. She had some trouble with her travel arrangements." "A pleasure, Miss Covington," Brody said, tipping his hat. "Welcome to Redemption Creek." He then turned his attention back to Caleb, his expression growing more serious. "Came out to tell you something. Two strangers rode into town yesterday." Asking questions, Caleb's posture straightened, his senses immediately on high alert. "What kind of questions?" "Asking if anyone had seen a new arrival, a young woman from the east." "Described her pretty well," Brody said, glancing meaningfully at Eliza. "Said she was a relative who'd run off with some family heirlooms. They seemed more like bounty hunters than concerned family to me. Hard men. One with a nasty scar across his cheek." Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The blood drained from her face. "My cousin," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Alistair. He must have sent them. But I stole nothing. He lied to me. He must have wanted me gone for some reason. And this is how he ensures I never return to Philadelphia to contest him." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her cousin's generosity had been a lie, a cruel trick to dispose of her and secure his claim on her parents' modest estate. The accusation of theft was a way to discredit her, to turn her into a fugitive. Caleb's gray eyes turned to steel. He looked at Eliza's terrified face, and a cold, protective fury rose within him. These men were not just a threat to a stranger. They were a threat to her. "Where are they now?" he asked the sheriff, his voice dangerously low. "Left the saloon an hour ago. Said they were going to check the outlying homesteads. They'll be out this way eventually," Brody warned. "Be careful, Caleb. They look like the kind of men who'd shoot first and ask questions later." After the sheriff left, a tense silence descended. The vast, open landscape that had seemed beautiful to Eliza and now felt menacing, exposed. There was nowhere to hide. "He lied about everything," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She was shaking, not from fear, but from the chilling betrayal. "My own family." Caleb stepped closer to her, his presence a solid, reassuring wall. He did not touch her, but his proximity was a comfort. "Some men are poison," he said, his voice flat. "It's not a reflection on you." He looked out at the horizon, his gaze scanning the plains. "They will come here, but they will not take you." The words were a simple statement of fact, an unbreakable promise. In that moment, he ceased to be merely her reluctant host. He became her protector. The external threat had solidified their bond in a way that quiet dinners and shared chores never could. He was no longer just guarding his solitude. He was guarding her life. His carefully constructed world of isolation was about to be tested by violence, and the thought of her coming to harm ignited a fire in him he had not felt since the war. The next day passed in a state of high tension. Caleb spent the morning cleaning and oiling his rifle and 2 pistols, his movements economical and precise. He was a man preparing for a battle he knew was inevitable. He instructed Eliza to stay inside, away from the windows. The cabin, once a symbol of his isolation, now felt like a fortress, and she, the person he was determined to defend within its walls. Eliza, however, refused to be a passive damsel in distress. The initial shock and fear had given way to a cold, hard resolve. She had been deceived and hunted, and she would not cower in a corner while a man she barely knew fought her battles. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice steady. Caleb looked at her, surprised by the steel in her tone. He saw not a frightened city girl, but a woman of substance. He hesitated, his instinct to shield her warring with his practical nature. "You can load a rifle?" "My father taught me to shoot," she said. He believed a woman should be able to protect herself. He nodded slowly, a flicker of new respect in his eyes. He retrieved a second rifle, a smaller Winchester, from a trunk and laid it on the table. He showed her how to work the lever action, how to load the cartridges. Her hands were steady, her movements quick and sure. She was a fast learner. He was beginning to realize she was nothing like his late wife, Sarah. Sarah had been soft, gentle, a creature of peace. Eliza had a core of iron. As dusk began to settle, casting long shadows across the land, they saw two riders approaching. They were not moving with the easy gait of neighbors, but with the purposeful stride of predators. Caleb watched them from the window, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "That's them," he said. One with the scar, Eliza stood beside him, her own rifle held tightly in her hands. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her mind was clear. The two men reined in their horses just beyond the fence line, about 100 yards from the cabin. "Blackwood," the man with the scar shouted, his voice coarse. "We know you've got the girl. Send her out, and we'll be on our way." "We have no quarrel with you," Caleb's response was a single, sharp crack of his rifle. The bullet kicked up a puff of dust a foot from the lead horse's hooves. The animal shied, snorting in panic. It was a warning shot, a clear and unambiguous answer. The second man, a hulking brute with a vacant expression, cursed and raised his own rifle. "Stubborn fool, get down," Caleb ordered, pulling Eliza away from the window as a bullet splintered the wooden frame where her head had just been. They crouched below the sill, the scent of gunpowder and shattered pine filling the air. The battle had begun. The sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into the gray twilight that precedes true darkness. The two men had taken cover behind a rocky outcrop, and a tense standoff ensued. Gunshots echoed sporadically, the flashes of light from the rifle barrels like angry fireflies in the gloom. Caleb was methodical, a seasoned soldier. He never wasted a shot, firing only when he had a clear target, forcing the men to keep their heads down. Eliza stayed beside him, her initial fear replaced by a focused adrenaline. She reloaded the spare rifle, her fingers moving deftly, ensuring he always had a ready weapon. She was his partner in this fight, not a liability to be protected. "They're waiting for full dark," Caleb muttered, peering through a crack in the logs. "They'll try to rush the cabin then." He looked at her, his face grim in the fading light. This could get bad. Eliza, it was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it on his lips, spoken with such gravity, forged another link in the chain that was binding them together. "We will face it together," she said, her voice unwavering. As the last vestiges of light vanished, the attack came. The two men broke from cover, running toward the cabin from different angles, firing as they came. Bullets thudded into the log walls like angry fists. Caleb moved from window to window, returning fire, his movements a blur of deadly efficiency. He dropped the larger man with a clean shot to the leg, the man's cry of pain cutting through the night. But the man with the scar was faster, more cunning. He used the distraction to reach the porch, slamming his body against the heavy oak door. The wood groaned, the iron hinges straining. Caleb was at the far window, reloading. He wouldn't get to the door in time. "Eliza, get back," he yelled. The door burst open with a splintering crash. The scarred man stood silhouetted in the doorway, a pistol in his hand, his face a snarl of triumph. He saw Eliza, his target, standing near the hearth, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. But Eliza did not scream. She did not cower. In the split second that he raised his pistol, she acted. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and with a strength born of desperation and fury, she swung it with all her might. The poker connected with the man's gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone. He howled in pain, his pistol clattering to the floor. The sound of Caleb's rifle deafened the room. The scarred man jerked backward as if punched, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before collapsing onto the porch, still and silent. Silence descended, thick and absolute. The only sounds were Eliza's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of her own heart. The smell of gunpowder was acrid in the air. She stared at the fallen man, the poker still gripped in her white-knuckled hands. She had faced down the monster from her nightmares and had not flinched. Caleb was at her side in an instant, his rifle lowered. He gently took the poker from her trembling hands. He looked from a man on the porch to her, his eyes searching her face. He saw no hysteria, only shock and a fierce, warrior-like resolve. She had not been a victim. She had been a fighter. She had saved herself. She had saved him. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers cupped her cheek. His touch was rough from calluses, but surprisingly gentle. It was a gesture of such profound tenderness, so at odds with the violence of the preceding moments, that it shattered her composure. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "It's over," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're safe." The near loss of her had ripped through the scar tissue around his heart. When he had seen that man in the doorway, his pistol aimed at her, the world had gone silent. The thought of losing her, of seeing that vibrant life extinguished, had been more terrifying than any battlefield he had ever faced. It was a pain that dwarfed the old grief, a fresh, sharp agony that told him the undeniable truth. His fortress of solitude had not just been breached, it had been leveled. And in its place stood this courageous, resilient woman. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not just the woman he had rescued, but the woman who had, in turn, rescued him from the gray prison of his own making. The carefully constructed walls he had built to keep the world out had crumbled to dust. He tried to stop loving, to stop feeling, to stop living. But she had brought life back into his home and into his heart, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his very soul, that he could not live without her. "Eliza," he began, his voice thick, the name a prayer on his lips. He pulled her away from the grim scene at the door, leading her toward the fire, which still crackled in the hearth, a beacon of warmth and light in the dark, violent night. He turned her to face him, his hands gripping her upper arms, needing to feel that she was real, that she was unharmed. "I was wrong," he said, his stormy gray eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "I told you attachments were a weakness. I told you a man survives alone. I was a fool," his grip on her arms gentled, his thumbs stroking her skin. "When I saw him raise that pistol at you, I realized that a life without you in it is not safety. It is a wasteland. It is nothing." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. The raw, desperate honesty in his voice stripped away all pretense, all the barriers they had kept between them. This was not the terse, guarded man she had come to know. This was the man beneath the armor, his heart laid bare. "Caleb," she whispered, her own emotions overwhelming her. "I have done nothing but try to push you away since the moment you arrived," he continued, his voice cracking with the strain of his confession. "I was afraid, not of them." He gestured vaguely toward the door, "but of this, of feeling this. I swore I would never feel this again." He let out a ragged breath. "But you walked into my quiet life and filled it with color, with courage. I cannot go back to the silence, Eliza. I don't want to." He finally looked her directly in the eye, and the grief and solitude were gone, replaced by a fierce, unwavering devotion. "I love you." The words, so simple and so profound, hung in the air between them. They were the key that unlocked the final gate to her own heart. She had respected him. She had been grateful to him. She had felt a deep empathy for his pain. But in the crucible of shared danger, and in the light of his stunning vulnerability, she knew her own feelings ran much deeper. She loved this broken, honorable, fiercely protective man. She loved the kindness he tried so hard to hide, and the strength he showed so effortlessly. "Oh, Caleb," she breathed, tears of relief and joy now streaming down her face. "I love you." Too, his face, so often a mask of grim control, broke into a look of profound relief. He closed the small space between them, his head lowering to hers. His kiss was not gentle or tentative. It was desperate, hungry, a confirmation of everything he had just said. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving and had just been offered a feast, the kiss of a man who had been drowning and had just found air. It was a promise of a future, a sealing of a bond forged in fear and tempered by love. She responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him. In the aftermath of violence and death, they found life, vibrant and undeniable, in each other's arms. The next morning, Sheriff Brody arrived with 2 deputies, his face grave. Caleb had ridden into town at dawn to fetch him. The bodies had been removed, and the wounded man was now locked in the town jail, awaiting the circuit judge. Brody listened intently as Caleb recounted the events of the previous night, his narrative clipped and factual, but with one significant addition. "Eliza saved my life," Caleb said, looking at her where she stood on the porch, her face pale, but her expression resolute. "She fought back. He would have killed me if not for her." Sheriff Brody's gaze softened as he looked at Eliza, his respect for her evident. "You got a fighter here, Caleb," he said quietly. "You'd be a fool to let her go." "I don't intend to," Caleb replied, his voice firm. After the sheriff left, a quiet peace settled over the ranch. The scars of the battle were there, the splintered door, the bullet holes in the walls, but they felt like relics of a past that was already receding. Caleb set about repairing the damage, his movements sure and purposeful. Eliza brought him a cup of coffee, her hand steady as she gave it to him. He took it from her, his fingers brushing hers. He set the cup aside and reached into the small leather pouch he always wore on his belt. He pulled out a small, tarnished silver ring, intricately carved with tiny vines. It was not ornate, but it had the simple, elegant beauty of something made with love. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice soft. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to Sarah." He paused, taking a breath. "Sarah, she would have wanted someone strong and good to wear it. Someone who understands that life is worth fighting for." He looked at Eliza, his heart in his eyes. "I know this is fast. I know your world has been turned upside down. But I also know that I don't want to face another sunrise without you by my side. Eliza Covington, will you marry me? Will you build a new life with me here?" Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but these were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. This was not the life she had imagined when she boarded the train in Philadelphia, but it was a life she now wanted more than anything. A life of substance, of truth, with a man of honor and courage. A life she would choose, actively and with all her heart. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Caleb, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, breathing in her scent. The ghosts of his past were finally at peace, not banished, but integrated into a future that was bright with promise. He was no longer Caleb Blackwood, the wounded loner. He was Caleb Blackwood, the man who loved Eliza. News of the attack and the subsequent engagement spread through Redemption Creek like a prairie fire. The initial gossip about the mysterious woman at the Blackwood Ranch transformed into a story of heroism and romance. When Caleb and Eliza rode into town a week later for supplies, they were met not with suspicious stares, but with nods of respect and warm smiles. The community, which had always kept a respectful distance from the grieving recluse, now opened its arms to the couple. Martha was overjoyed, hugging Eliza tightly. "I knew there was a spark in him yet," she declared, beaming. "He just needed the right flint to strike it." Mr. Abernathy from the station tipped his hat, and even the gruff blacksmith offered his congratulations. The people of Redemption Creek, hardy pioneers who understood the value of partnership and courage, saw in Caleb and Eliza 2 people who had found a home in each other. They were not just a couple. They were a symbol of the town's own ethos, survival, resilience, and the building of a new life in a harsh but beautiful land. Their wedding, held 2 weeks later by the circuit preacher, was a town affair. The entire population of Redemption Creek seemed to cram into the small, newly built church, their presence a powerful testament to their acceptance and support. They were no longer outsiders, but a cherished part of the community's fabric. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shafts of light across the porch of the expanded cabin. What had once been a starkly masculine dwelling was now a home, softened by touches of feminine grace. Pots of cheerful geraniums sat on the railing, and crisp white curtains fluttered in the windows. The silence that had once defined the Blackwood Ranch was gone, replaced by a symphony of life. Eliza sat in a sturdy rocking chair that Caleb had built for her, her fingers deftly mending a small tear in a tiny pair of denim overalls. Her hair, the color of warm honey, was braided loosely and fell over one shoulder. A look of serene contentment had settled on her features, erasing the last traces of the frightened, lost woman who had stepped off the train. She was no longer a fish out of water. She was a woman who had found her ocean. The Wyoming landscape was no longer alien to her. It was the beautiful, sprawling backyard of her home. A peal of delighted laughter drew her attention. Out in the yard, near the large cottonwood tree, Caleb was swinging a small boy in the air. The child, just over a year old, had his father's dark hair and his mother's bright blue eyes. His name was Daniel. It had been Eliza's suggestion, a way to honor the past without being imprisoned by it, to let the name signify not loss, but a continuation of love. Caleb's face, once a mask of stoic grief, was now open and expressive, lit from within by a joy he no longer tried to hide. He laughed with his son, a deep, rumbling sound that was the new music of the ranch. He was still a man of quiet strength, but the harsh edges had been worn smooth by love and happiness. He was a husband and a father, roles he had once thought were lost to him forever. He set young Daniel down on the grass, and the boy took a few wobbly steps before tumbling down, giggling. The ranch was prospering. Caleb, with Eliza's sharp mind for ledgers and planning, had expanded his herd. They had hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, and the one silent cabin was now often filled with the easy camaraderie of shared labor. The fortress of solitude had become a beacon of community and life. Caleb walked over to the porch and sat on the steps at Eliza's feet, leaning his head back against her knees. She paused in her sewing, her hand coming down to rest in his dark hair, her fingers gently tracing patterns. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching their son explore a dandelion with intense concentration. Sheriff Brody was by earlier, Caleb said, his voice a low, contented rumble. The circuit judge gave that man from the jailhouse 20 years. He said the authorities back east finally caught up with your cousin. Seems Alistair Finch was a swindler through and through. Lost everything. Eliza felt a distant, faint echo of the betrayal, but it had no power over her now. That part of her life felt as if it had happened to someone else in another lifetime. He built his life on lies, she said softly. It was bound to crumble. She looked around at the solid reality of her world. The strong man beside her, the healthy child in the yard, the sturdy home they had built together. We built ours on truth. Caleb reached up and took her hand, the one that wore his grandmother's silver ring, and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. You were the best risk I ever took, he murmured against her skin. She smiled, her heart full to bursting. And you, she replied, were the safest harbor I ever found. He turned his head, his stormy gray eyes, now clear and calm as a mountain lake, meeting hers. The love that flowed between them was a tangible thing, as real and enduring as the mountains that stood sentinel on the horizon. He had risked his life for a stranger, and in doing so had found his own. She had lost a life she thought she wanted, only to discover the one she was truly meant to live. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of purple and gold, they watched their son, a living testament to their shared future, and knew they were finally, truly home.